This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 440 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network.
Thanks for tuning in.
Before looking at this week's trends, I want to remind you guys that during every week of the NFL season, I do a snake draft on FanDuel Live with my colleagues Brandon Gadula and Jim Sonis. They're Friday afternoons at 3:30 Eastern. Each week, we go through a three-way snake draft. We talk about slate strategy, and we help you get ready for the week. For those who tune in live this week, we'll be giving away a free ticket to the Sunday Million right after the draft ends. For more info on the live stream and the free Sunday Million ticket, subscribe to FanDuel's YouTube page or follow FanDuel across social media. That way you won't miss it. Before Le'Veon Bell signed with the Chiefs, Clyde Edwards-Helaire was averaging an 81.1% running back rush share per game. Over the last 2 weeks, his running back rush shares have been 47.1% and 31.6%. CEH never dipped below 10 rushing attempts before Le'Veon Bell entered the picture. In the 2 games with Bell, he's had 8 and 6 rushing attempts. Now, before you get upset, I know the last 2 weeks have been blowout wins for the Chiefs, but the gap here doesn't really explain that. In week 7, before garbage time happened, CEH's running back rush share was about 57%. That's still significantly lower than what we'd seen before Bell. This past week, the Chiefs really had just one drive where they weren't featuring CEH or Bell. On their final drive, Darrell Williams and Darwin Thompson had 7 total rush attempts. Take those out of the equation from week 8, and you're still looking at a running back rush share from CEH of 50%, because both CEH and Bell had 6 carries. And then on top of that, CEH saw his target share dip to just 6% in week 8. That was the first time that it was in the single digits since week 1. Like I said in last week's 15 transaction show, I'm not calling CEH irrelevant moving forward. It's just that people are acting as though this Le'Veon Bell signing hasn't made that big of an impact because there are reasons for these dips in numbers. And while that's true, there are reasons for these numbers being lower. There aren't reasons for the numbers being this much lower. Well, there are reasons, and that reason's Le'Veon Bell. This next trend is one that I saw on Twitter, and I thought that I would dig a little bit deeper on it. But according to Field Yates, you guys know Field from ESPN, Travis Fulgham has more fantasy points than any other wide receiver since week 4, which was his debut for the Eagles. He also has the most receiving yards. And this is no fluke. He's seeing the volume in the peripherals. Over this time, he's averaging more than a 25% target share per game for Philadelphia. Over his last 4 games, that number's 29%. With the Eagles' upcoming schedule, like I talked about on yesterday's show, he should be here to stay through the rest of the season, and hopefully beyond. So every week, I think that my numbers are screwed up when I see how Seattle's defended wide receivers. I open my spreadsheet, I look at how bad Seattle's been, and I say, this is not right. Something went wrong. When looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed, which is just me looking at how many points per game a team has allowed versus how many points per game their opponents have scored, Seattle has played over 20 PPR points per game below expectation against wide receivers this year. So in other words, team wide receivers as a group, team wide receivers have scored 20 more points per game against Seattle than what we've observed from their season-long average. Not only is it the highest or the worst mark in the league, but the team that's second worst, which is Cleveland, they've played a little over 7 points below expectation. So it's a dramatic difference between Seattle and Cleveland. So keep targeting that Seahawks secondary. On average, teams are allowing roughly 1 wide receiver touchdown per game across the NFL. It's a little bit over 1. Minnesota, though, they're allowing more than 2 wide receiver touchdowns per contest this season. They've allowed 17 passing touchdowns this year, which is tied for the 4th most in the NFL. 15 of those 17 have gone to wide receivers. That's the highest number in the league. I don't think this means to automatically target Minnesota. I mean, you should because it is a beatable secondary. But they're 7th in yards allowed to wide receivers. So there's a little bit of regression coming. I just thought that it was interesting overall. The Patriots currently have a pass-to-rush touchdown ratio of 0.3. They've had 3 passing touchdowns and 10 rushing touchdowns. Now, I tweeted this on Monday, but the Patriots are one of 13 teams since the year 2000 to have thrown 3 or fewer passing touchdowns across the first 8 weeks of the season. And that ratio is absolutely absurd, too. Looking back to 2011, The lowest pass-to-rush touchdown ratio that we have seen came from the 2016 Bills. Their ratio was 0.59. We should expect some regression from this New England Patriots offense, at least in terms of how they're scoring touchdowns. Trend 6 is one from my friend Rich Rebar from Sharp Football Analysis, or Lord Reebs on Twitter, but he tweeted this week that 52 running backs have at least 50 touches this season. J.K. Dobbins leads all of those running backs in missed tackle rate per touch at 32.7%. The player in last, Mark Ingram, at 5.7%. Meanwhile, looking into Dobbins a little bit more, without Ingram last week, his running back rush share was 48.4%. The game prior, when Ingram was banged up, it was 32.1%. From week 1 through week 5, he was averaging a running back rush share of just 15%. So this Ingram injury is opening things up for J.K. Dobbins. And we kind of knew that. But because of this effectiveness, he could very easily see more and more volume moving forward. And he should. If you guys have watched J.K. Dobbins, you would agree with that. Marvin Jones has a target share per game of 17.5% over his last 3 contests. Across his first 4, that number was closer to 14%. And more specifically, over the games when Kenny Golladay came back and was active, it was more like 8%. What I'm saying here is that number 1, Jones has been a little bit more involved in this offense over the last few weeks. But number 2, he's seen an obvious target share spike without Kenny Golladay. And now Babytron is hurt. So Jones is very much in play here this week, especially against that aforementioned Vikings secondary. Over the last 3 weeks, Rob Gronkowski has scored more fantasy points per game than any other tight end not named Travis Kelce. My colleague Jim Sonis had a really good stat pull this week. He found that Gronk now has more deep ball targets than Mike Evans on the season. It took a little to get Gronk going, but Gronk is an every week starter now moving forward. Before week 8 in his 2 previous games, Jonathan Taylor saw 75% and 92% of Indianapolis' rushes. That dropped to below 31% in week 8. Now again, I'll reiterate what was said on yesterday's show. It sounds like Taylor's dealing with some sort of ankle injury. But I also simultaneously believe that Taylor's absolutely underperformed versus expectation this year. The Colts have a really favorable schedule from here on out. So if you have Jonathan Taylor, you have to hold Jonathan Taylor. And if you want to take on a high variance player, I'm not even against trading for him given that schedule, as long as you can buy really, really low. We know that things can turn around fast in the NFL, and he was a really good prospect. But there's a lot of worry right now with Jonathan Taylor. The last trend this week is a Buffalo Bills backfield update. I talked about Zach Moss and Devin Singletary last week, and this week, Moss ended up completely splitting that backfield up 50-50. Both were pretty effective on the ground, and both saw the same number of targets. The difference is that Moss, which we already knew, was the goal line back. He had 3 goal line rushes in that game against New England. I think it's pretty clear that we should favor Moss to Singletary right now. But I also think that both players are going to probably be a headache in fantasy football moving forward. Like, both of them are fine. They're both like RB3 types. But neither guy without an injury is going to be some league winner in my opinion. But I do want it to be known, just like last week, that Zach Moss continues to trend up. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the Weekly Matchup Show.